Learning objectives. After completing this module, learners will be able to understand and explain the factors that led to globalization with reference to Silk routes. Understand and explain how the pattern of food production changed in the 19th century. Understand and describe the philosophy of Satyagraha. Understand and analyze the global impact of the First World War. Understand and explain the repercussions post-war settlements and Bretton Woods institutions. The pre-modern world. The term globalization, as used today, refers to growing interconnectedness between various countries in the past 50 years. But human societies actually have been interlinked since times immemorial through travelers, traders, priests, and pilgrims. Silk routes link the world. The Silk routes, believed to have existed even before the Christian era, were a vast network of trade routes spread across the continent of Asia and connecting Asia with European and African countries. Due to the movement of westbound Chinese silk cargoes along these trade routes, they acquired the name Silk routes. Chinese pottery, spices, and textiles from India and Southeast Asia, precious metals like gold and silver from Europe, and many other goods were exchanged through silk routes. Trade also led to cultural exchange. Silk routes played a crucial role in the spread of Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism across the globe. Food travels, spaghetti and potato. Traders and merchants introduced new crops and ready food to the lands they visited, and also carried foodstuffs and crops peculiar to other lands to their countries. Noodles from China acquired the name spaghetti in Europe. After Columbus discovered America in 1492, potatoes, soya, groundnuts, maize, tomatoes, chilies, sweet potatoes, etc. were introduced to European and Asian countries. In Ireland, people became so dependent on potatoes that when potato crop was destroyed due to a disease, people in large numbers starved to death. Conquest, disease, and trade. Indian Ocean for centuries had been a busy route for trade, cultural exchange, knowledge, goods, and people. In the 16th century, European sailors discovered a sea route to India and America. They used it profitably to expand their trade. America, meanwhile, had developed in complete isolation of the world around. Silver mines in present-day Peru and Mexico enhanced the wealth of Europeans and helped finance their trade. Europeans also sailed to El Dorado, the fabled city of gold in America. The Spaniards and Portuguese conquered a large part of America not by using superior arms and ammunitions, but by introducing the germs of smallpox in America long before they set foot on the continent. Since the natives had not developed any immunity against the disease due to isolation, it wiped out the entire native population. With none to confront, the Europeans easily established their control on the continent. Hunger and poverty was widespread in 19th century Europe. Religious conflicts and persecution of dissenters was commonplace. To escape punishment, the dissenters often fled to America, where the Europeans already had huge plantations, where African slaves grew sugar and cotton for European markets. Till the middle of 18th century, India and China were the richest countries. By 15th century, while China minimized trade interactions with foreign countries, America rose in importance, which shifted the focus of trade to Europe. The 19th century, 1815 to 1914. Economists recognize three types of flow or movements within the international economic exchange in the 19th century society: flow of trade, flow of labor, flow of capital. A world economy takes shape. Corn Law, which restricted import of corns in Britain, was abolished under pressure from industrialists and urban dwellers. The local industry could not compete with the resultant fall in food grain prices. People lost work and migrated overseas. Industrialization led to higher income and more consumption in Britain. To meet the growing demand, vast agricultural lands in America, Australia, Russia, and Eastern Europe needed more capital and labor. Capital flowed from financial centers in London. Millions of people migrated to America and Australia for employment and meet the demand for labor. By 1890, a global agricultural economy came into existence with complex changes in flow of labor, capital, and nature of trade. Role of technology. Major technological inventions and innovations like railways, steamship, telegraph, and technique of refrigeration during this period were the result of larger social, political, and economic factors. The colonizers needed better infrastructure for faster communication and movement of goods. Late 19th century colonialism. In 1885, big European powers met in Berlin to divide Africa into colonies. Due to deliberate division, most of the boundaries in the map of Africa are straight lines. Britain and France got vast overseas territories. Belgium and Germany became new colonies and US became a colonial power by late 1890s by acquiring some colonies earlier held by Spain. Rinderpest or the cattle plague. Europeans wanting to exploit Africa's land and mineral resources faced an acute shortage of labor for plantations and mines. Africa's limited population owned vast lands and livestock. They were unwilling to work for wages. To obtain labor, the Europeans imposed heavy taxes, which could be paid back only by working for wages. They altered inheritance laws. Only one person in the family could inherit land. The rest were forced to work for wages. Mine workers were not allowed to leave the compound. Amidst these developments arrived the deadly disease, Rinderpest, carried by infected cattle imported from British Asia. In 5 years, it killed almost 90% of the cattle. Loss of cattle forced the natives into labor market, facilitating European conquest of Africa. Indentured labor migration from India. In the 19th century, thousands of Indian and Chinese laborers went to work on plantations, in mines, road and railway construction projects across the globe as indentured labor. Indentured labor worked under contracts for a fixed duration. Most of them came from eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, central India and dry districts of Tamil Nadu. Decline in local industries forced the people to migrate for work. Agents engaged by employers lured people to destinations like Caribbean islands, Mauritius and Fiji. Tamil migrants went to Ceylon and Malaya. The agents made false promises about final destinations, nature of work, living and working conditions. The laborers had no legal rights. A cultural fusion that emerged out of the stay of indentured labor reflects in Trinidad's Writers' Carnival Jose, protest religion Rastafarianism or chutney music. Indian entrepreneurs abroad. Big plantation owners who were growing crops for the world market often borrowed money from banks or markets. Shikaripuri Shroffs and Nattukottai Chettiars were well-known Indian bankers. They financed export agriculture in Central and Southeast Asia, either from their own funds or borrowed from European banks. Indian traders and moneylenders also reached Africa after the European colonizers. Hyderabadi Sindhi traders ventured beyond European colonies. In 1860s, they set up emporia at busy ports, usually selling local and imported articles to tourists. Indian trade, colonialism and the global system. Since ages, fine cotton from India was exported to Europe. After Industrial Revolution, British cotton manufacture expanded. British industrialists pressurized the government to impose restriction on cotton imports to protect local industry. They eyed overseas markets to dump their cloth. From 30% in 1800, the demand for Indian cotton fell to a mere 3% by 1870s. However, between 1812 and 1817, the export of raw cotton rose to 35% against 5%. Indigo, used to dye fabric, also became a major item of export. Britain sold its goods at higher rates but purchased raw materials very cheap from India. It created a trade deficit, which Britain used to balance its trade deficits with other countries, where its imports exceeded exports. Britain used income from Indian market to pay home charges to its working as well as retired British officials posted in India. It also included payment of India's external debts and expenditures on other British colonies. The interwar economy. The First World War, 1914 to 18, was mainly fought between two power blocs. The Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, later joined by the US, and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. Wartime transformations. World's leading industrial nations confronted each other with machine guns, tanks, aircrafts, chemical weapons, etc. All products of modern, large-scale industries on a massive scale in the First World War. The war left 9 million dead and 20 million injured. It reduced the able-bodied workforce in Europe, depreciating household incomes. While men were engaged in war, women took up supposedly male jobs in factories. Economic ties between some dominant economic powers also ended with the war. Britain had borrowed huge amounts of money from US banks and US public. Post-war, US became an international creditor. US government and citizens owned more overseas assets than other governments or citizens owned in the US. Post-war recovery. While Britain, the world's largest economy, was occupied with war, industries developed in India and Japan. Post-war, Britain could not regain its dominant position in India or compete with Japan. Huge loans taken from the US made Britain a debtor country. The economic boom caused by the war came to an end after the war. Production in industries contracted and unemployment increased. During the war, Australia, Canada, and America had increased wheat production. When Eastern Europe, a major supplier of wheat before war, revived wheat production after the war, the prices of grain fell. It reduced. Rise of mass production and consumption. The US economy recovered from the impact of war in 1920s. Mass production became its characteristic feature. Henry Ford, well-known car manufacturer, adopted the assembly line method, which increased the pace of production while cutting cost and price of engineered goods. This method became popular in Europe too. From 2 million in 1919, car production in the US increased to more than 5 million in 1929. Large investments in house construction and the hire purchase system, which let people pay through monthly or weekly installments, brought about a consumer boom. Increased demand was accompanied by increased production, more income and prosperity in the US. The Great Depression. In 1923, the US and the European economies were well on the path of recovery till a major part of the world was hit by the Great Depression in 1929. It lasted till mid-1930s. Agricultural overproduction was one of the reasons. Excessive farm produce led to slump in prices and shrank the incomes of farmers. In 1929, investments reduced to one-fourth of the previous years in the countries dependent on loans from USA. During this financial crisis, USA withdrew its loans. Several banks in Europe as well as US closed. Many companies collapsed. India and the Great Depression. Due to the Great Depression, colonial India's exports and imports reduced to half between 1928 and 1934. But the colonial government did not reduce revenue demands. It severely hit Indian farmers. India's exports of precious metals and gold at this time only helped stabilize British economy. Mahatma Gandhi launched the civil disobedience movement in this background. Rebuilding a world economy, the post-war era. Post-war settlement and the Bretton Woods institutions. The post-war reconstruction was influenced by two major factors. 1. Emergence of US as the dominant economic, political and military power in the West. 2. Transformation of the Soviet Union from a backward agricultural economy into a world power. Post-war, the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, held in July 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA, aimed at 1. Maintaining economic stability and optimum employment in the industrial world. 2. Control on the flow of goods, capital and labor by governments. The conference established the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to balance external surpluses and deficits of its member nations, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, also called the World Bank, to finance post-war reconstruction. The Bretton Woods system was based on fixed exchange rates. In this system, an exchange rate for currencies was fixed against dollar. Dollar was valued against gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce of gold. The early post-war years. Due to the Bretton Woods system, the world trade experienced an annual and stable growth rate of 8% between 1950 to 1970. The unemployed rate also averaged less than 5% in industrial nations. The developing nations followed in the footsteps of industrially advanced nations. Decolonization and independence. 2 decades after the Second World War, many colonies in Asia and Africa emerged as independent nations. Years of exploitation by colonial governments had drained them of their natural and economic resources. The IMF and the World Bank, established to meet the financial needs of the industrial countries, could not cope with the challenges faced by the former colonies. In the late 1950s, the Bretton Woods institutions focused on developing countries. Unfortunately, the newly independent nations had to seek guidance from the international agencies dominated by former colonial powers, who still wielded control over resources of their former colonies. They evade exploitation. The developing nations formed the Group of 77 or G77, and demanded a new International Economic Order (NIEO) for developmental assistance and economic promotion. End of Bretton Woods and beginning of globalization. From 1960s, unprofitable overseas involvements diminished the US's finances and competitive strength. The value of US dollar weakened against gold. Thus, the system of fixed exchange rates was replaced by the system of floating exchange rates. Mid-1970s onwards, the developing countries who could obtain loans or developmental assistance from the international institutions were directed to borrow from the Western commercial banks and private lending institutions. It caused increased debt crisis, lower incomes, and immense poverty in Africa and Latin America. In mid-1970s, the MNCs moved production operations to low-wages Asian countries. It impacted world trade and capital flow. In the last 2 decades, countries like India, China, and Brazil have transformed into stronger economies. Summary. Let us summarize what we have learned in this module. Human societies have been interlinked since times immemorial through travelers, traders, priests, and pilgrims. The Silk Routes were a vast network of trade routes spread across the continent of Asia and connecting Asia with European and African countries. The Spaniards and Portuguese conquered a large part of America, not by using superior arms and ammunitions, but by introducing the germs of smallpox in America long. Economists recognize 3 types of flows or movements within the international economic exchange in the 19th century society: flow of trade, flow of labor, flow of capital. In 1885, big European powers met in Berlin to divide Africa into colonies. The deadly disease Rinderpest reached Africa through infected cattle imported from British Asia. In 5 years, it killed almost 90% of the cattle. Indian traders and money lenders also reached Africa after the European colonizers. Britain sold its goods at higher rates, but purchased raw materials very cheap from India. In the First World War, leading industrial nations confronted each other with machine guns, tanks, aircrafts, chemical weapons, etc. The world was hit by the Great Depression in 1929. It lasted till mid-1930s. The Second World War broke out in 1939. Post-war, the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference held in July 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA. The conference established the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, also called the World Bank. To evade exploitation, the developing nations formed the Group of 77 or G77 and demanded a new international economic order